Well, it's great to be here and see an audience. I've been doing this for 2 years with an empty room, and this is delightful. Michael, thank you so much. This is a real honor to be in conversation with you about a very important topic, building better.
Sure.
We heard the bio, but perhaps you can tell us a bit more about what else do you do at Oxford Properties? What is it that keeps you ticking?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, everybody. For those of you in New York, and I'm not sure exactly where we're broadcasting around the world, but thank you for having me. And it's also a pleasure to be in a room with people again and starting to get used to this and enjoying it. Oxford, a little bit about us. Oxford is a 62-year-old business. At this stage in our journey, I would describe us as a real estate investor, asset manager, and business builder. And what that means is we deploy capital and we manage a series of businesses around the world in service of our stakeholder, which is a pension plan. And one of the things amongst many that are quite gratifying about the job is to work in great cities and have a tremendous impact on the communities in which we invest, in which we operate.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a great cue for what I wanted to talk to you about is homes and housing, places where we've spent more time, I suppose, than we have prior to COVID. We've had to find uses, many different uses for our homes beyond just living in them. But I know that Oxford is doing some really interesting things with that asset class. Would love to hear, some of the innovative things that you're doing.
Sure. So if you open a newspaper in a city around the world in which we operate, which are, on 4 continents across 16 countries, you're going to find, just like you will here in New York City, if you open the local newspaper, real issues around housing choice and housing affordability. So for us to have a good investment thesis, I think we have to have something that's also got a social benefit in order for it to be, relevant for society and for governments to support. So housing is an acute challenge that major urban areas have around the world, and we see ourselves as playing a very active role in providing housing supply and housing choice. And sometimes that comes in the form of, vertical high-rise, which is purpose-built for rent. And in some cases, it comes in the form of horizontal housing, which is also purpose-built for rental, but in that case, more oriented to single-family dwellings and people who don't necessarily all want to live in the city. And we have a variety of different companies and ways in which we do this around the world. So for those of you who are in New York, you'll know there's about 3.6 million rental apartments in New York City. There's a many decade-long history of people building and operating high-rise apartments in this city. But if you go to a jurisdiction like London on the other side of the Atlantic, there is really no formal industry where there are professional businesses that build housing and provide housing to those who need to rent it. So we find that there's a real opportunity to take the expertise we have from one jurisdiction in the world and export it and partner with people in other parts of the world in order for us, obviously, to generate an economic benefit, but also at the same time to generate a social benefit for the communities in which we operate.
Yeah, I'm curious about housing in terms of jurisdictions that you operate in. You must be seeing differences. I was actually looking at one of the presentations you must have made at one of the Urban Land Institute conferences, and you had a very interesting graphic which was at 5 layers, and you had access, placemaking, physicality, digital. I'm just curious, when you are entering a site or an opportunity with housing in mind, how do you actually approach it? What are the ways that Oxford brings its distinctive approach to development, to housing developments?
Well, that's a very specific question in the communities in which we operate. So I would say one thing that is distinctive is we don't have a distinctive, this is vanilla ice cream and everybody around the world must like and eat vanilla ice cream. Fully respect the fact that the differences between Sydney and Boston are meaningful, that those communities vary, that the local building code differs, that the needs of residents and the view of policymakers varies considerably. So I would say our contribution in terms of how does Oxford approach it is a little bit more around how do we share best practices, how do we provide a forum amongst our different businesses to knowledge share, send people around the world, and pick up what are the lessons learned in one jurisdiction that apply to another jurisdiction. So we're quite distributed because we are a big organization. And one thing I've learned is trying to manage from the center is not very effective. So we would empower our teams to really make great decisions in the communities they operate. And I think we have a good track record in that, usually turning out pretty well.
I suppose you're back on the road now, so are you traveling to different parts of the world where you have assets?
I am back on the road. I mean, I did, like I'm sure some or many in the room, also travel through COVID. But what I was most concerned about was getting stuck in a jurisdiction and separated from my family. In fact, that did happen once. So at this point, it's nice to be traveling again without COVID restrictions. And I've been back to Australia. I hadn't been there in 3 years. I've been back to London many times over the last year. And as we talked about, I'll be back in Singapore at the end of this month.
Yeah, looking forward to you being there. But I'm going to ask a slightly tough question now. Of all the places you've been to and now are going back to, is there a favorite that's emerging? I know it's a bit of a, you can't demonstrate bias, but it's World City. So which is your favorite city?
I don't have a favorite city, if I'm honest. They all offer something different. So at the moment, and for the last several years, I've been living here in New York, which I think is one of the greatest cities in the world. And whenever I go to London, I long for the public space and the cleaner sidewalks that they have there as compared to New York City. Or if you're in Sydney, really appreciate the weather. Of course, my hometown is Toronto, which I also think is a terrific city. So every place has its own set of newspapers and local issues and great restaurants and different cultural contributions. And I think one of the joys of my job, quite frankly, is I get to have a small flavor of these as I go around and hang out with our teams around the world.
Very diplomatically handled.
It's also the truth, so it's easy to speak truth.
You had to say New York is the greatest, of course. We're in New York, one of the great cities of the world. I'm going to turn attention to innovation, given that we are the Global Forum for Urban Innovation. Now, I know Oxford is also deeply interested in building life sciences anchored innovation districts, innovation precincts. We've just come out of this, kind of coming out of the pandemic. Tell us a bit more about innovation precincts and your approach to it and what can we expect from Oxford.
Yeah, thank you for asking. And specifically, we were talking about this beforehand, the vernacular that I would use is life sciences. So if you pick on the theme of housing, there is a social need there. Cities and citizens need housing choice and housing supply. Similarly, there's a social good related to healthcare, and there's an enormous innovation that's been going on for the last several decades, and I'm not the expert, so I won't pretend to be, around how healthcare delivery is changing on the backs of scientific innovation and development. And the delivery of multiple vaccines for COVID under a short period of time is I can't think of a better demonstration of that in action. And what we've learned, and others who are also investors in real estate and have taken an interest in this sector have learned, is that around the confluence of great basic research, institutions that know how to commercialize that research, venture funding, good policy, talent, et cetera, are emergent economies and centers of life sciences activity in innovation and company creation. So the obvious examples in America would be Boston, San Francisco, San Diego, et cetera. And there are more. And we see ourselves as playing an important role in providing the critical infrastructure for the scientists, so the scientists can focus on the science. That's the part that they get. And the infrastructure is not the same as, but it's analogous to, let's say, data centers, where the infrastructure is, the operation of it is critical to the delivery of that outcome. So for those who are watching abroad, if the data centers around the world are interrupted, they're not going to see this through the cloud. Same thing with an RMNA vaccine. You need those labs functioning, and you need the downstream space, the manufacturing space functioning in order for those products and services to be delivered. So we think we have a terrific opportunity to invest in that space. We've done it at scale for several years, and we find ourselves almost always welcomed with open arms with government who are trying to find a way to deliver healthcare innovation and critical therapies to their citizens, both in research and development and in life sciences manufacturing.
I want to touch on what you just said because there are probably government officials and investment agencies watching and probably in the room. You are one of the leading investors in this area. What do you look for in an invitation from a government? What is the expectation? What would make a particular location desirable from your perspective?
Yep, it's a great question. And we ran an exercise in COVID, and we're not very good at marketing, although I think some of my marketing partners are here and they probably don't like me saying that. So we came up with a catchphrase called Project Warp Speed, because we just copied what the government was coming up with. The idea there was to figure out what are the critical ingredients that spawn some jurisdictions to be terrific at life sciences and reach that critical mass, and others don't. And we actually trained a computer model, and it spit out some signs for us around where we thought the next opportunities would be. And you wouldn't be surprised that some of the things I mentioned were the critical inputs. So number of patents filed, which isn't enough. There's some universities that deliver an enormous amount of medical and scientific discovery patents, but they haven't figured out how to turn those into commercialization. Venture formation and venture investing. And then of course, talent. For a life sciences company, it needs clinicians, it needs people who understand how to run these labs. And when you see a confluence of those research, commercial, and policy initiatives, there are some jurisdictions that have reached a tipping point. So the newer ones in the United States would be places like Seattle, Raleigh-Durham. We would see the same kind of conditions at different scales in markets like Vancouver, Toronto. In Europe, Paris is a meaningful source of drug discovery and innovation, but it doesn't have a lot of critical infrastructure. Same with the United Kingdom. They are desperately in need of life sciences infrastructure, and so much so that their industry is hampered by the fact that they don't have enough of the asset base to support the intellectual property base. So I'm not sure if that gets to what you were asking. The next part, of course, in this journey is manufacturing. So manufacturing drugs that are made through new scientific therapies and tools is different than chemical drug manufacturing, where have problem, mix chemicals, make pill. It's a very different process. And as we saw in COVID, that healthcare and healthcare resilience was also tied to, what are your own national security interests? A lot of governments are equally critically interested in figuring out how do they manufacture and how do they have their own critical mass of manufacturing infrastructure in their jurisdictions to meet their needs in a time of not just good, but crisis.
No, I was hoping that, and I suspect it is part of the mix, is fun. I was reading about San Diego becoming a life sciences cluster at one point in time. Apparently all the scientists went there because of the great weather and it's surfing. So I'm wondering if, as you look at new jurisdictions, is that a part of it? Because ultimately, I suppose scientists are also people and they want to have fun. But is that something that drives the culture?
For those that I know that live in San Diego, they have a lot of fun. And San Diego has been a very important source of life sciences innovation for a long time, really probably with the University of San Diego, and it produces some terrific talent and innovation. So it's not a new thing. They've been doing this for 20 or 30 years.
So all the governments who are listening, make sure you're bringing in the right restaurants and bringing in the recreation and the leisure. I want to quickly turn to maybe two more insights, given that we are going to be running out of time soon. One is, there's a lot of interest in the future of work. Any high points on what you're seeing within your company and commercial offices that you own?
Well, I think for all of us, it's been an absolute wild ride. And if I was asked to imagine that, the workplace or the office would be shut down either by mandate or preference or some combination of the both, and say people are going to go and work from home for 2 years, I would have said, you're out of your mind. That will never happen. Of course, history is a great reminder to be humble. I think the workplace is going through an enormous number of changes. One is, we're at the halfway point. I think 2022 is the halfway point in markets or countries like the United States, where the boomers are halfway retired, and they will fully retire out of the workforce over the next sort of 3 to 5 years. And a lot of their kids are already in the workforce, millennials. And so we've got a shifting demographic in terms of the composition of people who will go into an office. At the same time, I think we've gone fully remote, and we were talking about this outside the room. We've seen some of the pushback from our own employees around that as it relates to our mentorship, onboarding, learning and development, and so on and so forth. So our youngest employees, for example, are the ones who are the most unenamored by the COVID work experience. They want to be back in the office. They want engagement. And for a lot of us early in our career, the office is an extension of your social network, and you build new relationships in the workplace outside of college for the first time. So it's important for us, I can only speak to us as an employer, that we have an employee workforce that is engaged. And for those who are wanting to be fully remote, I don't think we're the right employer. And I think culturally it becomes very difficult to build affinity and culture within an organization when you're a fully remote organization. I'm sure some will be able to do it. We won't. So if I use our own lens to answer your question, the future of work, hybrid work is here to stay. It's definitely changed how people work. And we are seeing the evidence in basically every city around the world, including New York City, that we're going to see more and more people come back to the office, and it's not going to come back to the levels of pre-pandemic.
Final thought, you use the word social a lot, and I think that's reflective of obviously the value that real estate creates ultimately. It's social value, social health. Any final thoughts on building better for society?
Well, I applaud the content of the conference. For us, selfishly, this is an easy fit because, of course, we work in cities around the world and we care about their health and well-being. And critically for myself, our stakeholder is a pension plan, and those pension plan beneficiaries are all municipal employees. Whether they might be social workers, they might drive ambulances, they might work to better our communities in all kinds of ways. And so ultimately, the economic benefits we accrue go to them in terms of their social benefits that their members have. So there's a nice tie-in here as it relates to doing social good and at the same time accruing an economic benefit for your stakeholder.
Super. Michael Turner, thank you so much, and thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Smooth.